What is the longevity of the impact you want to have? You need to be externally thinking as much as you think internally. You have to think about the greater ecosystem and then being humble. That humility goes a long way. You want to make sure that they know you exist. And if they do know you exist, you want to make sure that they think about you positive. If they think about you in a neutral way, that just means that they don't know you enough for them to have an opinion. You need to be able to tell your story and show your impact because that's how you build that momentum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Community Transformation Podcast brought to you by Mwano Consultancy. I'm here with my colleague, Millie. We're super excited for our conversation today. We're going to be diving deeper, unpacking some of the different moving parts, community partners, grant makers, essentially all the different groups that we work with that are community related and what we've learned through it. And hopefully there's some good nuggets that you can take from this interview. Millie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for this. So I want to ask you first, what do grant makers look for in nonprofits when it comes to providing funds?
We've had the opportunity to work with many different grant makers, and a lot of times when you look at the grant makers' objectives, there's always a theme in terms of what's going on with the community or the areas of focus that they have. At a broader standpoint, it's very straightforward. Either if they're doing early childhood or end homeless, providing food with substance use disorder, right? So some grant makers have specific areas of focus, or they might have folks in-house that are designated to certain areas that are impacting the community. So at a high level, you see the alignment there, and a lot of the grants and the resources that they're giving out is influenced by that. But then when you go the next layer is really about what do they look for in order for them to feel comfortable to fund certain organization, but also the amount, right? The commitment that they might have. So a lot of this is built on trust, and some grant makers have legacy relationships with certain organizations that over the years they felt more comfortable funding. And it's really different for newer organizations or organizations that don't have relationship with them yet. They have their own barometer that they're going to evaluate in order to determine if they're going to fund you and how much they're going to fund you. So some of that, it's influenced by credibility, but also they're confident in you as a nonprofit if you're going to deliver. So some grant makers, they have some restriction in what they're going to give out and how they're going to give out. So they want to make sure that there's a return. Meaning that what you're stating that you're going to do, when you get the fund, you're actually going to do it. And unfortunately, because resources sometimes are limited, grant makers are very picky on who they fund. So I would say your reputation and also consistency and also the level of commitment that you have in the community that you're reaching. And then more importantly, if you're new or there's some sort of a focus that they have on you in order to decide if they're going to fund you or not, they might call other folks that they trust in the community in order to see, hey, what's the experience that you've had with this particular organization, just so they can do their due diligence to make sure that if they go with you, that you're going to deliver. But they are very choosy and picky, I would say.
No, definitely.
And there's a lot of different factors that contribute to it.
Yeah, I mean, in that answer, I have a lot of more questions. I guess my first question is, how can they authentically align their missions and operations in that way? Like with the things that you explained, how can they authentically experience it and show it to those grant makers?
So on the nonprofit side?
Yeah.
So the nonprofit, I think it's really important for the nonprofits to do their diligence in terms of researching the funder, but also looking at their areas of focus. You look at their annual reports, who they funded in the past. You can even go as far as looking at their blog, article, their social media present. If you analyze that, you will see a lot of the areas of focus and what they're also passionate about. So through that, it gives you a lot of information to figure out how do you position your organization to them. So you got to do that first. You got to really, really figure out who that grant maker is and what they care about and what they're funding. And the only way to do that is by doing what I just told you, like doing the back end research, visiting their website. And then I also think it's important to reach out to, if they have program directors or program managers that oversee certain grants. If you see that there's some that fall maybe under the areas of focus that you have, see if you can get a phone call with them or an interview. And so part of that is to try to figure out, you don't want to elicit them. You want to just listen and ask them a bunch of questions like, hey, I want to better learn what your mission is as a grant maker. What are the areas where you're seeing the biggest need? What is the area where you're focusing on? And those program director or program manager will have a lot of information on what has informed the way that they fund stuff and who they're funded. And that insight is super important, because then you can take all that information and then evaluate if you as a nonprofit are suitable for that particular grant maker. If there's areas where you are, then you got to build your strategy and how to get their attention. So part of your strategy is really positioning your organization at the highest level that reflects where the area of focus that grant maker is in. So then once you do that, you try to figure out then the different types of grants that they give out. Do they have reoccurring grants? Do they have a one-time grant? In order to figure out, do we want to go to usually the reoccurring one is usually, it might be a higher amount and there might be more requirements that you have to meet in order for you to qualify for it. So sometimes it's like, they might have things like you have to be existent for at least a minimum of 3 years or 5 years. Your board structure might be this. Like they have a bunch of stuff. If you don't have some of that stuff in place, it might make sense to not go for it right now and maybe go for one that's less restrictive, just so you have your foot in. And if you do a great job, then you can cultivate the relationship over time. But if you go for the big one, maybe your organization doesn't have all, the checkbox things that they're looking for. For a lot of those grant makers, they wouldn't really even consider you. And I've been on the back end of that. I've helped some smaller nonprofit over the years. And there's been times where I felt like the mission of the nonprofit the mission and the impact was substantial enough to go to engage with pretty much any grant makers that was also funding similar things. But there's been times where we did that, but we didn't have those other stuff, like maybe our board structure, maybe our existence. Maybe there's one organization where we were around for many years, but we were under another fiscal agent. So when we went on our own, some of the grant makers didn't really consider all those other years that we've been in existence. They only focused on when we got our EIN number, where is our federal tax ID number. So, and that was really frustrating, because now we almost had to start from scratch with some of these grant makers. So that's why I would say it's really important to figure out, you got to have a strategy. And a lot of that strategy is figuring out, how do you get in? How do you come to the intention of these grant makers, so then you can cultivate the relationship? Because even the other grant makers, other nonprofits that they have stronger relationships with, they've had to cultivate it over time in order to get to where it is now. Unfortunately, sometimes there are some benefits, meaning it might be a board member that knows somebody that works there, right? Yeah. So it's like that board member might call someone from that grant making organization and say, hey, there's this nonprofit, right? So it's like there is a lot of inside job that happens, but I do think that positioning your organization in a way that connects to the bottom line of that grant maker and showing the impact might be the best way to get their attention. And you might have to do other stuff too. It's like if they have an annual conference that they do, try to see if there's a slot maybe for you to be a panelist. And again, just remember, you have to highlight the impact of the services that you're offering. Don't let the story of the people that you're serving and the impact of it to be the connection with the grant maker. If you can do that successfully, they'll be able to, one, recognize that you exist. Two, they might be more open to give you a chance. So they might say, hey, you're not ready for our big grants yet, but we have a smaller grant, right? And then if you get that smaller grant, you got to be on your A game. You got to do all the stuff. You got to have all the reporting and really show the impact. And the more you do that, the more it gives them faith in your organization. So as more opportunity comes, they're going to consider you. But it is super competitive. And I know those who are listening that have you run a nonprofit, like you know how competitive it is with trying to pursue these funds.
So then how would you say, you said that one thing that you said was make sure that your impact is shown. So for example, if you're not a small nonprofit organization, how can you show that? Can you give us some strategies in order for us to make us unique compared to another nonprofit?
Tell your story. I would say that's the starting point. Document your services and the impact that it has in the community. And so part of that is like literally having a strategy on a monthly basis where you're recording the impact that your organization is making. And you want it to be visual. So if there's opportunity to capture photos and really hone in on where you started, what you did, how you identify the problem, what you did for the solution, who benefited from the solution, and the impact it has. Tell your story on blogs, if there's local newspapers or websites, and try to see if they can profile you. Because the more you tell your story from a visible standpoint, the better those grant makers, one, they might have a chance to learn about you. And then also like that outside visibility, if there's a news outlet that picks up the story, like usually in most community, like those grant makers are already in that space reading different things that different news outlets are doing. So if you can get your story published there, definitely capture your story and publish it. Even if you published it on your own website, reshare it on your social media, tag it, right? You want to be active. You want to look active. You want to share it. The more you tell your story, the more you have an existent record of the impact that you're making. So then when you are reaching out to the grant makers, they're going to go to your website. They're going to look at your pictures. They're going to look at your articles, your blogs. They're going to go to your social media. And if those outlets represents the story of the people that you're serving, then that's the testimony already. And for a lot of grant makers, it goes a long way, because nowadays many grant makers are really starting to focus on direct impact, because we've been on the back end of helping some grant makers and funders, whatever. That's pretty much the same thing. Figuring out what's their bottom line. I think through COVID, a lot of grant makers realized that they might have funded things that didn't really tie directly to the solution of those who were most impacted, or they didn't have a way to track it fully. Now, many grant makers are becoming more and more direct on that. So as a nonprofit, small nonprofit, if you tell your story, it's captured and you share it, that visibility comes full circle. So that's one way. Definitely capture your story, tell your story. Two would be, if there's any convening, make sure that you're on their radar. Check out their blogs. Try to see if there's a way to pitch a story to them, to the grant makers, around work that you're doing that's relevant to their areas of focus. Most communication managers or director working for a grant making organization, they're always looking for content. Yeah. And you see them resharing a lot of external articles that has nothing to do with what they've created themselves. So if you can find a good way of pitching a story to them, if it relates to the community that they're serving, if it's written well and it's compelling, more likely they're going to share it. So now you're giving them some free content. Again, you're becoming in their radar. And then the other one is, if there's any convening that they do, or if they have a newsletter, you definitely want to be in their newsletter. Like, you want to make sure that you have a pulse of what's happening. Any convening, attend their convening, tell your story when there's an opportunity to, bring a brochure, right? You want to build your capacity so they know you exist. All of those are like super important, because if you're in their radar, even if they don't think that you're in a place where they can do reoccurring funding that's substantial, when the small ones are there, they're going to definitely consider you for sure. So those are some of my strategy. I think it's important because it's two things. Many nonprofits that are running organizations, they might focus on their services, which is great because that's where, you know, those who are on the receiving end of those services are benefiting. But there's also this other thing, which is cultivating partnership and relationship with grant makers and municipality entities. And you have to do both at the same time, because the other one allows for more funding opportunity. But then the important one is also the services that you're providing to those who are benefiting from it, because you want to make sure that you're doing a great job. So you want to be very strategic on that, but I would definitely come back to telling your story. Please tell your story.
Depending on qualitative or quantitative data, is there a place that you should kind of emphasize on? Because I remember us working with different grant makers. There are times that they wanted that quantitative data, but then they also wanted that qualitative. For like a small nonprofit, which one should they emphasize more?
I think it's important to do both. And a lot of times when nonprofit think about quantitative, they get very scared by it because it sounds cumbersome. Like, oh, I gotta have this again. I mean, nowadays there's basic tools like Google Forms. If you have a Google account, you can use Google Form. Come up with some questions in there, send it to your constituents or the people that are benefiting from your services. Get their feedback. If you're capturing things like attendance, how many people that are attending your stuff, how many people you're serving, what's the retention, how frequent are they coming back? I mean, those are basic. If you can show that, that's the starting point. So it's just a matter of being intentional to capture that. So that's on the quantitative side. And then you can have other matrix, right? Outside of that, you can dive even deeper, right? You can segment it by demographic, you can segment it. But then on the qualitative side, the testimonies are so important, and find ways to do that where, you know, maybe once a month or quarterly, you do some focus group with the people that you're serving to ask them questions about their experience, successes that they're having, continual challenges that they're facing. The more you do that, the more you have an opportunity to aggregate that data. So at any time, if a grant maker is like, how many people are you serving? What's the age group, right? You can pull that data out fairly quickly. And then it also shows that you're working diligently and you have a system in place. And then the qualitative stories could be testimonies that you share on your website, you can share on your newsletter, you can share on your blogs, right? And the coolest thing about the testimony is it's the folks that are benefiting from your services story. So if you can do those two things, ongoing, anytime a grant maker asks for it, you're just going to be able to provide it because you're already doing it. And the hard part that we hear a lot from small and nonprofit is that, oh, I'm so busy running operation, I don't have the bandwidth to do that. But it's like you need to have those basic data, because it can't just be anecdotal. You can't just say, oh, we did this, we did, like, it's like, okay, show me. Because a lot of the grant makers, they need to report on their money as well. Some money that they have it's restrictive. It's coming from either a family that's donated, or it could be federally provided. So they want to also capture their ROI. And the better process you have and you show that, the more faith they're going to have, because they know that it's going to be easy to get the data from you after. So I would say start basic. Even if it was a notebook where you wrote the stuff, find a way to translate that data into a Google Doc. I'm saying a Google Doc is the easiest way to do it. And just find your folks on your team, either it's you, or you do it on a monthly basis and you review it and you say, where are we? Who are we serving? What's our bottom line? What we're trying to... So the quantitative and qualitative is critical. It is a must. You need to have some sort of a strategy in place that you're implementing on a regular basis.
Okay, let's go back to the point that you said that they don't have the time. So with that, how can they develop or even have like the small, quick strategies in order for them to build those connections with the grant makers? Like, what can they do that's authentic but doesn't waste the time to just tell stories and hang around?
Yeah, I think it's the hardest thing that many nonprofit directors or founders face is the difference between what you need to do to continue to build your organization from the requirement of the outside world, meaning like Grantmakers and all these different community partners, versus what you need to continue to do to run your services.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on where the area of focus is, many nonprofits will focus their attention more around the services because there's a direct connection there. And sometimes in result of that, they might justify certain things that they're not able to do. The infrastructure stuff is a must. Like, you have to find time and you have to prioritize on doing those other things because it's just part of the industry. Like, it's part of being in that space. Unless if you don't really care about developing relationship with grant makers for you to get more resources, then you can run your organization whichever way you want. But if you care about that and you want to increase your funding, then you also have to know what they're looking for. So what they're looking for ends up being the driver of how you prioritize what you do as a grant maker, you know? And it has to be embedded. Like, if you don't have time, then there's been times where I've worked with smaller nonprofits where I said, you're asking the grant maker to make an exception, but you're not willing to make an exception yourself in your approach, so then you can meet them where they are. At the end of the day, certain things that they're asking from you, they're going to need it no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
So either you abide by it and increase the likelihood to get the funding, or you don't abide by it and you find another grant maker that you want to pursue. But certain things, most of these grant makers are looking for the same thing. And it's hard for some of those nonprofits to hear that because some don't understand how the nonprofit grant making space operates. Mm-hmm. And it creates a lot of frustration because some director feels like they're intentionally being excluded, where in some cases it might not be that. It just might be that the founder or the CEO or the director of that nonprofit has their priority and their focus on something else, and they're hoping that the grant maker will change. But the reality is they might not change. They might never change what they're looking for, you know? So yeah, that's definitely what I would say. I think, and it's with humility. I think you gotta have a lot of humility when you're running a nonprofit, because those who control the money will make you sometimes jump over hoops and do all this stuff just to get the resources. Unfortunately, that's kind of part of what you need to play by. But I do have to say, going back to what I said earlier, many grant makers are making some adjustment in how they do their business to be more flexible and more considerate of the different moving parts that different nonprofits have and are going through that might either exclude them from getting the money.
Well, what would you say for a small nonprofit if they're competing with larger nonprofits, especially for like a specific grant, the same fundings? What can set them off that makes them different compared to that larger nonprofit?
Yeah, I would say go back to the impact. Find kind of the way I started in the conversation. Find where the intersection is between what the grant makers wants, what their bottom line is, versus what you're doing to serve your community, and then amplify it. So going back to the stuff that I was saying, capture the story, package the story, tell the story, and then get the grant maker's intention by engaging with them, reaching out to them, telling them about your existence, but then showing your impact. I also think a lot of nonprofits have to just be very strategic in their approach.
What do you mean by that?
Like, a lot of the stuff is not as linear. Like, it's not just that there's an RFP out for a grant, you submit it. Like, you want to make sure that they know you exist. And if they do know you exist, you want to make sure that they think about you positively when any reference to your organization is brought up. And part of that is you need to be able to tell your story and show your impact. That's the only way people are going to think about you positively, right? Like if they think about you in a neutral way, that just means that they don't know you enough for them to have an opinion. But you want them, when they think about your program or your organization, to be like, oh yeah, that's the so-and-so. It seems like they're really like, their community really benefits from them, right? That's a positive thing associated to how people think about you. Or, yeah, it could be anything. It could be any example that they have when you're brought up, because that's how you build that momentum, right? But a lot of times folks would be like, they would never attend a convening, never participate in any form of thing that Grantmaker does. But every year when it's the grant cycle, you submit something. And then you get denied, and then you're mad about it. But you haven't strategized anything to strengthen your relationship with the grant maker. So you're just waiting, right? You're just waiting around thinking that something's going to change. Maybe it's never going to change because, one, they don't know you, they don't know the impact that you're making. So it's like, it's a hustle. You got to definitely be able to hustle out there and figure out the best way to tell those stories. So I keep going back to that. And then part of it, sometimes you also have to be vulnerable too. You have to say, hey, right now there might be certain things that we don't have, or it doesn't show because we actually don't have that because, 60 to 75% of our resources, we focus on this because of this reason. We do know that if we're going to catapult and continue to evolve as an organization, we're going to have to meet some of this requirement. And right now, our hope is to build our capacity. Are there anything that you can help us and support us on, or who you can recommend, right? Like, Grantmakers, they want to be useful. So even if they're not funding you, if you can come with a relationship with that vulnerability, some program managers and program director are so connected to so many different things, they might have somebody that they can refer you to. And that goes by, that's a starting point. And I get that a lot. Like a lot of times, program manager and program director that work for a grant maker, they reach out to us often and say, hey, Dale, there's this organization or there's this individual that's trying to, can you? And then the other way around, we play a bridge a lot too. Sometimes we might call the grant maker and say, hey, so-and-so is trying to do this. Is there any way you can meet with them? And so it goes both ways, but you definitely have to do the work, and a lot of that will come from telling your story.
Well, thank you. What about when it comes to local community connections? I know you spoke on building those relationships with the grant makers, but what can those roles of those small local community
the people that they're serving,
possible, or even just the people around them?
Yeah, I think you want to be connected to your community 100%. I think you want to be connected holistically. You want to attend stuff. You want to sponsor stuff. You want to show up. You want to partner with other organizations that might have another area of focus. Be a true servant. If you're a good servant when it comes to serving your constituents or your community, do that too with the community as a whole. And because they will see that you're selfless, and it's not just about the bottom line of your organization. And sometimes you might have to make a sacrifice. You might be like, hey, maybe we donate some of our resource to this cause because we believe in it. But when you do that, it's a proof of concept. It's a proof of relationship building, and they were gonna say, wow, you really believe in what we're doing, and you cut a piece of your pie to give us. Like, that goes a long way, because a lot of the communities are like very small, meaning there's a lot of touch points of different organizations are serving a lot of the same people. And if you're consistent in that, in finding ways to build partnerships and being on the ground level, then that's the grounding. And I feel like sometimes nonprofits can be very selfish at times, where they're just focusing on them, even when their mission is great. But you need to be able to permeate externally and come alongside other organization, other community in whatever means that you have. You might have to take a little sacrifice, but it goes a long way. So I think that's important. And part of our podcast is to be able to make those connections in our work, showing different folks what we've learned and being able to give them opportunity to think about how they might put different strategy in place to build their capacity from a relationship standpoint, but also from a system standpoint. And hopefully there's more resources that comes to them.
Okay. From your experience, can you give advice to a small nonprofit that just started, like 5 steps that they have to do before reaching out to a grant maker?
Yeah, so this will be for our closing. I think it's really important, one, to identify your impact, identify who you're trying to connect with, what is the longevity of the impact you want to have, and more importantly, how do you do it within an ecosystem. And I think you're always going to be, you need to be externally thinking as much as you think internally. You have to think about the greater ecosystem and what it means for you. And then being humble that you might not know certain things. And if you identify the things that you don't know, being able to go out and finding the resources to build on your knowledge, so then you can figure out what you need to do in those appropriate spaces. But I do think that humility goes a long way. And then when the gap is shown, do the work. You have to do the work to build that capacity. Millie, thank you so much for very thoughtful questions you posed today in our podcast. I think it's really important for those who listen to our work to be able to figure out that we can all support one another, but it's also important to acknowledge what we don't know. Mm-hmm. We don't know, so then we can get the tools that we need in order to build capacity. And I would say it goes both ways. Grant makers are looking for an opportunity to be more effective, and then the nonprofits are looking for opportunity to get more resources for them to be effective. So thank you for listening to our podcast. Please share, subscribe, and have a great day. Thank you so much. Community Transformation Podcast. Here we go. Wow.
Yeah.